break or?
It's no, I think it's week 7. But I've been on study leave, so I've been blissfully kind of unaware of term dates mostly. So
All right, okay. Oh yeah, I forget. It's the trimester, right? Because most
yes.
of the universities have their break. Okay.
Mhm.
So how is everyone? Like I heard that Dennis is out there in Ireland. So
Yeah, yeah. He's been running
Mhm.
around the globe doing all sorts of impressive things. So yeah, no, everyone's going well. How about you?
All right, right. I'm good, good. Right. I visited UNSW last year, I guess, but we didn't get a chance to meet
Mm.
around October, I guess. I met
Hmm.
Hoa and Tony
Okay.
and then Andy too. Like,
Hmm.
yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay. So do you need a help to share your screen, your PowerPoint,
think
or
think I'm sorted. Do you want me to do it now or should we wait?
oh no, no, we can wait. You can do it later. Yeah,
Okay.
but later on, yeah, can you please send it to me after the talk because usually the
Mhm.
participants will want it.
Sure.
All right. Okay. Okay. So it's 4 p.m. there.
Yes, 5 to 4. Yeah.
Okay, so everyone's home already.
Yeah. Well, it's a Friday, so, you know.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for like agreeing to talk to us. Like it
No,
will
thank
be
you for the
very
invitation.
useful. Yeah. I tried to invite some of the other colleague from the Philippines. Like Dennis asked me to maybe like some of his former students want to join. But let's
Mhm.
see. Okay, there's still 13 participants. I hope they're on time. Like, okay. Just take your time to prepare, Megan. I'll put off the camera and then you
Sure.
can start again at all. Right.
That's
Okay.
good.
I see you.
Manusia kok. Enggak, kadang
Oke, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, good
Waalaikumsalam
afternoon,
warahmatullahi
everyone.
wabarakatuh.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Megan, it's going to be bilingual, but you can present your materials in full English, and I will help with the translation later when the participants are about to ask questions. Oke, selamat datang Bapak Ibu sekalian. Terima kasih banyak sudah bergabung. Hari ini kita kedatangan tamu spesial, seorang dosen senior dari University of New South Wales di Australia. Beliau ini merupakan ahli dalam sosiologi pendidikan dan juga di bidang pendidikan umum. Jadi, Dr. Megan Stacey is a senior lecturer in the UNSW School of Education, whose research focuses on the critical policy sociology of teachers' work. A former high school teacher, Megan completed her PhD with the University of Sydney in 2018. Her books include The Business of Teaching, Becoming a Teacher in a Market of Schools, published with Palgrave in 2020, and the co-edited collection, Analyzing Education Policy, Theory and Method, published with Routledge in 2024. Jadi beliaunya ini memang ahli di kebijakan kritis dan sosiologi dari pekerjaan-pekerjaan guru. Dulunya beliau ini adalah guru SMA, lalu menyelesaikan pendidikan S3 di University of Sydney tahun 2018. Sudah menerbitkan 2 buku, Bapak Ibu mungkin nanti bisa membaca ya. Bukunya tentang bisnis pengajaran, menjadi seorang guru di dalam pemasaran sekolah, dan juga buku satunya ini menganalisis kebijakan pendidikan, teori dan metodologi, seperti itu. Oke, sebelum kita mulai mendengarkan paparan dari Dr. Megan Stacey, please welcome Pak Dr. Agustinus as the head of school in the School of Pedagogy, the Directorate of Graduate Program in Universitas Muhammadiyah Malang. Please, Pak Agus, the time
Ya,
is
terima kasih, Kuliah. Thank you, Kuliah.
yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Good afternoon for everyone.
good afternoon.
Guys, lecture today we invite expert from University of Sydney, Your Honorable Dr. Megan Stacey. Good afternoon, Dr. Megan. How are you
Hello.
today?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Saya juga sebetulnya
Yeah, I am good too. Pada siang hari ini tema yang diangkat, the topic to discuss today about the curriculum the role of curriculum in addressing teacher workload, necessary solution and pedagogical intervention. Jadi kalau diterjemahkan di Indonesia itu kan yang menjadi pembahasan utama adalah beban kerja seorang guru. Bagaimana nanti the role of curriculum ini akan dibahas, disampaikan oleh Dr. Megan Stacey. This is not a easy problem, a simple problem, but I think the category is a complicated problem. Jadi apa tentang workload, teacher workload ini, beban kerja guru, dan persoalan apa yang melingkupinya, serta nanti akan diperbandingkan oleh Dr. Megan Stacey dari Australia. Bagaimana pengalaman yang baik di sana, best learn, best practice yang ada di sana, lesson learn-nya itu, yang bisa kita pakai terutama di Indonesia ya. Jadi saya kira itu pengantar dari saya. I think enough, and I will deliver to Ria Arista Asih again. Thank you. Selamat menikmati. Silahkan nanti ditanyakan. Yang boleh berpakai bahasa Indonesia dan juga boleh berbahasa Inggris. Saya kira demikian. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Pak Agus, for the opening remark. So once again, everyone, so Megan, they understand English very well, but mostly are passive. So they will understand your material clearly, I guess, but later on, I will help them to translate if they have any question. So they can ask in Bahasa Indonesia, whether like orally or just put it in the chat box. Jadi
Sure.
Bapak Ibu silakan ya, kalau ada pertanyaan, boleh langsung angkat tangan atau ditulis di kolom chat, boleh pakai bahasa Indonesia. Kalau mau pakai bahasa Inggris, you can use Google Translate. Nah, itu juga boleh. Okay. Okay, so without further ado, please welcome Dr. Megan Stacy. Please, Megan, the time is yours.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that slide now?
Yes.
Ria?
Yeah,
Yes,
very clear.
excellent. Wonderful. Okay. All right, let me just, there we go. Okay. All right, so, oh, hold on, no, here we go. There we go. Okay. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Megan, and I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. So thank you to Dr. Asih for the invitation. To start off, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations country from which I speak and upon which I've had the privilege of working and learning. So today I'm speaking from Gadigal country, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and any First Nations people who may be joining us. I'd like to note the rich knowledge of learning and teaching that's been engaged in on the land that I work upon since long before the intrusion of colonial systems of education, the operation of which I'll be discussing today. So with that, I'll now move to the topic of my talk. So today I'm going to be talking about a shift in the Australian education landscape that, with colleagues, I've observed over the past few years, in which the space in between the intended curriculum and the enacted curriculum within classrooms seems to have been increasingly opened up for public commentary and government as well as commercial intervention as a proposed way of addressing workload concerns, but I think with potential implications for teacher autonomy and teacher professionalism. So the paper that I'm presenting is entitled The Role of Curriculum in Addressing Teacher Workload, Necessary Solution or Pedagogical Intervention. So this paper is actually an amalgamation of 3 recent and forthcoming publications with 2 different sets of collaborators. So the first article that you can see there on the slide is with Susan McGrath-Champ and that research team. This was published, fully published this year, but first came out at the end of last year in the journal Discourse, Studies in the Cultural Politics of Education. And that was an analysis of a New South Wales education policy. And then publications 2 and 3 are on their way out in the latter half of this year, maybe early next year, with Professor Nicole Mockler from the University of Sydney. And that's a media analysis, mostly a media analysis project with a little bit of other document analysis in there as well. So today I'm going to be moving through these fairly sequentially, but I'm not going to be giving a summary of each necessarily, but just sort of drawing on each of these as I go. And what these 3 publications are all focused on in different ways is trying to understand the emergence of centralised curriculum materials or lesson plans, as it's sometimes referred to in this discourse that we've been observing, as a proposed solution to concerns about teacher workload. So my colleagues and I had seen this characterisation emerging in both federal and state fora. So federally, for example, we can see this quote on the screen from our Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, and I'll just give you a moment to read it. So in Australia, you may or may not know, government education is largely the responsibility of the states. However, there has been increasing federal intrusion into school education, both government and non-government, since the 1970s. And Labor governments, like that which Minister Clare is a part of, tend to like to focus their energies on education, especially in recent history. And for the current federal government, there has been a big concern with teacher shortages, and part of that has included concern with teacher workload. And I think teacher shortages and workload are actually kind of a global concern. I think there has been discussion on this in Indonesia as well. And certainly it's a part of the discourse in Australia. So my colleagues and I were very interested to hear Minister Clare taking on a line of argument like this one, which seems like it's about workload, but also is about the quality of what's happening in classrooms, if you look at the very last part of that quote. And we thought that was interesting, that there might be more going on here. If we look now to a state-based example, there was also discussion of lesson planning as a workload solution at state level. And here I'm going to talk about the state of New South Wales because that's where I'm based. In New South Wales, this positioning of lesson planning appeared in a formal policy called the Quality Time Action Plan. And you can see on the slide, although you probably can't read it, and that's okay, it's a snip from the original. The first image is a snip from the original Quality Time Action Plan in 2021, where they state that programming and lesson planning are time-consuming and something that can be done more efficiently through system-wide, high-quality and easily accessible teacher resources. The middle image is from the mid-year update to this plan, by which time they had solidified this resourcing proposal into something called the Universal Resources Hub. They state that teachers told us that curriculum resources and support was their most important priority area, which they've now addressed in this way. And we see the same logic in a press release about the Universal Resources Hub, which is the third image on the slide there, where it's got the title, "Number 1 Tax on Teachers' Time Solved," through the provision of these resources. So that's what they're proclaiming here. So we were interested in this policy and the similar statements from Minister Clare at a federal level that I showed on the previous slide for a few reasons. In particular, we were interested because work that I'd done with the first research group that I'm drawing on today with Susan Groshamp and her team indicated that lesson planning was work that Australian teachers actually highly value and wanted more time for, rather than to do less of or to have less involvement in. So we did a survey of over 18,000 New South Wales teachers specifically about workload in 2018, and they didn't identify lesson planning as a workload impost. Rather, they identified it as something that they wanted more time for. So it's not clear what data the New South Wales government was drawing on with this statement about it being the number 1 tax on teachers' time, because I think this data seems to be internal, so we can't access it, but it certainly didn't align with what we had found in our own study. But so what? Why does this matter? Well, because workload and work intensity, as I've been arguing with some other colleagues recently, are definitely problems for teachers. And I've cited some references for both Australia and Indonesia on the slide there. Whether curriculum might be a solution and what this might mean for teachers, though, depends on how curriculum is understood. So in my view, at least, teachers' curriculum work is really a very, very important part of what teaching actually is and what teachers value in what they do. But others, like policymakers and think tanks, perhaps, might not see it as being so fundamental. So I'll now just give some background on how curriculum can be conceptualised and the tensions that sit within this in different national contexts. So conceptualisations of curriculum range from what's planned for or intended through to what actually happens in classrooms or is enacted. Seeing the curriculum as enacted underlines the role of the teacher and resonates with views of curriculum as a social practice in which the intended curriculum can and arguably should actually look different in different classrooms according to different local contexts. And this is what's argued for example, in the body of work on funds of knowledge, if anyone has come across that. However, systems vary in where they fall on this continuum, so the extent to which teachers' curriculum work is trusted and valued. So for instance, in Scotland, the role of teachers as curriculum workers has been seeing renewed emphasis. In other countries, such as England, the policy context is such that teachers are primarily seen as those who deliver the syllabus. And there are still other countries in which the mode of this delivery is also prescribed, for instance, through government-mandated textbooks or literacy programs. In Australia, while there has been a fairly tightly bound curriculum as represented in syllabus documents for quite some time, including in relation to a nationally mandated curriculum, there have not really been any centralised resources, and certainly not in the state of New South Wales, which is what I'm mostly going to be talking about today. This has been left up to schools and teachers. In Indonesia, my understanding is that you have a relatively recent Kurnas or Curriculum Nasional. I believe you have to follow particular textbooks, but that there is also a fair amount of freedom in how you do so and the way in which resources and assessments can be localized and differently interpreted. So perhaps arising out of or related to this kind of variation we see in different contexts around how curriculum is understood, what it's understood to be, how it works. There is also emerging interest in the research literature in examining what happens in between the intended curriculum and the teacher, in particular via the role of non-government actors, including commercial interests through the development of programs and resources like textbooks, for example, but lots of other things too, which some of the references on the slide there speak to. And importantly, for my colleagues and I, at least in the context of Australia, we believe there's the potential for de-skilling teacher professional knowledge when curriculum work is considered appropriate for outsourcing in this way. And indeed, that's what we argue in our analysis of the New South Wales Quality Time Action Plan. So I'm now going to turn to talking about this first publication that I mentioned earlier. So for this analysis, we drew on Carol Backey's What's the Problem Represented to Be policy analysis method. And just in case you're not familiar with this method, I'll give a brief explanation. So it consists of 3 questions. Sorry, 3, what am I saying? 6 critical questions. And they're usually answered via analysis of 1 or more policy documents. So the premise of this approach is that policies do not respond to pre-existing problems, but that they actually construct problems in particular ways through their proposed solutions. So here are the questions. So what's the problem represented to be? What presuppositions or assumptions underlie this? How's this representation, sorry, I can't quite see my screen there, of the problem come about? What's left unproblematic, or where are the silences? What effects are produced? And how has this representation of the problem been sort of disseminated and defended publicly? So for our analysis, we used the Quality Time Action Plan and the mid-year update to that plan. I'm going to summarise our analysis in response to these questions in the next 3 slides. I'll be focusing on questions 1, 2, 5 and 6, just because I don't have time to do all of them. So the problem, as we saw it. Overall, the problem that was represented in this New South Wales policy around trying to save teachers' time was that there is too much low-value administrative work being done in schools. This was to be addressed through 6 opportunity areas. And I wonder, if you're looking at the slide there, if you notice anything about these opportunity areas and the kinds of solutions that I've just briefly summarised that were put forward in response to each of these. Well, we noticed 2 things. First, that most of these solutions were about streamlining or efficiency, often of the department's own processes rather than what was actually happening for teachers. So they weren't often actually about reducing or removing demands, just about making things more efficient. Second, we noticed that all of these areas were being categorised as administrative. I wonder if you agree with that. So this included areas like assessment and curriculum resourcing, things which actually involve quite considerable intellectual labour beyond just organisation, which is what's implied when we think about administration, I think. And this leads me to some of the key assumptions in this representation. Just move to the next slide there. The most important of which, I think, is that teaching only happens in the classroom. So this is not what I'm saying, but this is what we analysed as being a sort of discourse present in the policy, that teaching is just those moments in the classroom in front of students, and all work outside of that is just admin. And therefore, because it's admin and this policy is about addressing admin, we can reduce it and get rid of it. It doesn't really matter. We can get someone else to do it. So this led us to the argument that the policy had the potential to de-skill teachers by impinging upon work that they saw as actually quite core to what they're doing, lesson planning in particular. And we argued this due to that survey that I mentioned earlier, where we had a lot of teachers, in over 18,000, saying how they really wanted a reduction in face-to-face teaching time so that they could focus on planning and preparation as their number 1 workload strategy. So we see that the provision of the centralised universal resources hub that was being proposed for New South Wales had a potential subjectification effect, which is a term used by Backey, reshaping what it means to be a teacher by taking this work of lesson planning and putting it into the category of administration rather than teaching. And this, we think, was an important point because it emphasised quite a lot it was emphasised quite a lot in the media surrounding the policy. And I've just put again that snip that I showed you earlier, the media release from the department, where it's touted as the #1 tax on teachers' time solved. So interestingly, this press release also cited a concurrent think tank report, which was similarly recommending the centralisation of teachers' planning work. It was this report, interestingly, again, that was being referenced by Jason Clare in that quote I showed you right at the beginning of this talk. He mentioned a report, that's what he was speaking to, and it was this one that the New South Wales Department of Education is also talking about or referencing in there to support what they were doing. And this brings me back to the point that I started with, that this discussion of curriculum is not just a state issue. It's not just New South Wales. It is actually bigger than that. It's also federal. So it was clear to us that there was more going on than just activity within the New South Wales Department of Education. And this is where the second project on this topic comes in, this time with Professor Nicole Mockler from the University of Sydney. So I'm now going to move to discussion of the other two publications that I mentioned, which constitute an attempt to understand how this characterisation of lesson planning and curriculum work as a workload solution had taken hold in Australian public discourse. And to do this, we drew on a media analysis. Now, we used media because we'd seen, for instance, in the quote from Federal Minister Jason Clare, just how much these ideas were circulating within the media. So that quote was from a radio interview that he'd done, right, which counts as media. So we thought that this was one way to try and track how these discussions had emerged and developed over the past 5 years or so, which is when we'd sort of seen them take hold. So I'll describe this approach to you in a bit more detail now. Excuse me. So our focus was how teachers' curriculum work had been problematised in the Australian print media landscape. And our research questions, again, I've managed to block my slides, so I'm just going to move this slightly. How's the problem of teachers' curriculum work framed in the Australian print media, and who has framed the problem in that way, was our questions. For our sample, we drew on the Australian Teacher Corpus, which is a very, very large database of media articles substantively focused on teachers and teachers' work. This corpus was put together by my co-author, co-researcher, Nicole Mockler. I put a reference on the slide there to the book that she published a couple of years ago based on that corpus. But we used media articles within that over that 5-year period, 2019 to 2023. And we looked for particular terms, how they were used, came up with some particular sort of packages of terms that seem to be related to planning within this corpus that is already all about teachers, and then identified that there were actually 44 articles that were using these really consistently and really frequently. So they were talking about planning work. And then we did a closer analysis of those. So to do this closer analysis, answering question 1, we drew on framing theory. So what are the kinds of signatures, packages, ways in which teachers' curriculum work is being talked about within this data set? And then to answer question 2, we then went through this set of 44 articles that we'd sort of really strategically selected, I guess, and we tabulated who was the author affiliated with, what were they talking about, and who were they referencing. So were they quoting a particular think tank? Were they quoting a particular politician, for example? And also what kinds of frames were they drawing upon? So we'd already identified those in response to question 1, so then tabulating that as well. And that way we were able to see what the relationships were within this data set, which answers question 2 around who has done this framing within the media, who are the dominant voices, I guess. And we also used Gephi software, which is fairly commonly used in network analysis, and I'll show you a Gephi map in a few slides' time. So, to answer question 1, here are the 2 dominant frames that we identified via our analysis of the use of curriculum and lesson within the corpus. And these 2 frames were what we are terming the lesson lottery and curriculum and teacher workload. The lesson lottery was present in 35 of the 44 articles and workload in 26 of the 44. So I'm going to provide an overview of these 2 frames, but I will note at the outset that they are also closely interconnected, with workload often used as a support for arguments relating to the lesson lottery, but I'll get to that. For now, I'll begin with the most dominant frame, the lesson lottery. Excuse me. So as I mentioned, the lesson lottery was present in 35 of the 44 articles we looked at closely, and it was the sole frame in 18 of the 35. The frame's been named after the Grattan Institute report that was quoted by Minister Clare at the start, or referenced by Minister Clare that I showed you at the start. This report was entitled Ending the Lesson Lottery, How to Improve Curriculum Planning in Schools. So this was published in 2022, and it did see a lot of take up within the media. A lot of the articles we looked at in this subset of 44 were published in 2022. However, we are understanding this frame as per its logic. So there are also articles published earlier than this, which we've still categorised as adopting this frame. So what is the frame? Well, it goes a little something like this. Left to fend for themselves, teachers often end up creating lessons from scratch and scouring the internet and social media for teaching materials. The result is a lesson lottery. Or to paraphrase, that teachers may be teaching curriculum in an inconsistent way and that this is a problem. So the ways in which this is seen to be a problem are multiple, and I'll just outline a few of those now. The first way, and most important way, in which the lesson lottery is seen to be problematic is the perceived variability and inconsistency across lessons taught by teachers. As Haywood writes, this is from one of the articles included in the 44, the inevitable result of the near infinite decision-making required in teaching is a wide variation in teaching and learning between classrooms, resulting in a lesson lottery for students and teachers. So the logic of this claim is that variation in teaching and learning necessarily results in some lessons which are winners and some which are not, and therefore variation by itself is problematic. The metaphor of the lottery also suggests that teachers have very little ability to control the quality of the lessons that they provide. Instead, it's a matter of chance when they have so much freedom. And the issue of teacher control is a contested one within these articles, sometimes even within single voices. So on the one hand, we have nods to teacher autonomy made quite frequently, as in this quote from an opinion piece by Jordana Hunter of the Grattan Institute. All schools, all teachers should have ready access to high quality comprehensive curriculum materials that they can adapt and use if they choose. On the other hand, it's nevertheless this choice in how teachers interpret, engage in and present syllabus content that's also construed as the problem. And we see this in a quote from the same person, Jordana Hunter, but in an article by journalist Olivia Jenkins. So Hunter says, without a whole school approach to curriculum planning, even the hardest working teachers will struggle to give their students the best education. So while teacher autonomy through curricular contextualisation is given some limited space in the lesson lottery frame, ultimately it's seen as leading to poor student outcomes, even for the hardest working teachers. A further dimension to the lesson lottery is that it's seen to have an uneven impact on students. So it's seen as an equity issue. And this is summed up quite nicely in this quote from Ben Jensen, who works for another think tank in Australia called Learning First. I think he's the CEO actually. So he says, there's a cycle of poor expectations if we let teachers be in charge of this stuff, basically. So rather than seeing teachers' engagement with students' funds of knowledge, for instance, as a strength, as it's often construed in the academic literature, providing freedom in teachers' curriculum work is instead portrayed as an issue of quality in which there are negative consequences of this freedom for students experiencing disadvantage. And finally, the lesson lottery is portrayed as problematic because it doesn't make efficient use of funding. So in some articles, this expense was seen as being at least partially appropriate for outsourcing to private providers. So a quote here from Jensen and Murnane, that systems can fund private providers to develop some of these resources. So in this way, the lesson lottery frame is employed to widen the window into commercial influences upon schooling via the provision of curricular resources, reflecting the growing role of third sector actors in this space. So to summarise, the lesson lottery frame holds that variation in teaching is problematic and teachers have little control over the quality of what they do. And particularly, there are negative impacts for students experiencing disadvantage, and a solution to this is outsourcing, including to commercial providers. So now to move to the second frame, which is curriculum and teacher workload. So this was the second one that we identified, seen in 24 of the 44 articles we analysed. Most commonly in the data set, very commonly, workload was actually being used as a secondary frame to bolster the first frame of the lesson lottery. So that's why I mentioned earlier that these frames are closely interconnected. So I'll just give an example of that here. And I'll just let you read this one. So the workload frame in this way is often employed in support of what seems to be seen by some as a bigger issue, which is this improved quality and consistency of what's taught in Australian schools and how it's taught. The workload frame functioned as the sole frame in only 7 of the 44 articles we examined that were focused on teachers' curriculum work. Where workload was employed as the sole frame, one group of articles focuses on the potential of AI, and in particular ChatGPT, to reduce teacher workload, partly through assisting with lesson planning, which is very contextual, I think, kind of topic. And then a small number of articles explicitly describe lesson planning and curriculum work as workload imposts, but without this perceived variability and negative implications that come with the lesson lottery frame. So, for example, Williams talks about how early career teachers and teachers in small schools will be given additional help with planning to ease their workloads. Noticing here that this is not all teachers, it's not experienced teachers, it's just these specific groups that, that they're talking about, this being a problem for. So really, there were really very few, really almost no articles that actually talked about curriculum planning and lesson planning as a workload problem for teachers solely. Where it was talked about this, it had sort of contextual connections. So whether that's to do with ChatGPT or whether it's for this example on the screen, which is about small schools and new teachers. Otherwise, it was really always used to support this argument for centralising planning and sort of removing it a little bit more from teachers and their purview. So that's our analysis for the first research question of how teachers' curriculum work is being framed. I'm now going to talk about our second question regarding who's framed their work in these ways. And this is the start of the last part of my talk. I'm aware I'm slightly running out of time. So our analysis showed that this discussion was clearly being led by 2 dominant voices, and these were 2 think tanks, and I've already mentioned both of them in some of the quotes that I've given. So the Grattan Institute, which is a public policy think tank that looks at issues including but also beyond education, and Learning First, which is an education-specific think tank, as the name implies. The map on the slide, which is generated via Gephi, shows the dominance of these voices within the dataset. And you can see that Learning First and Grattan are quite big compared to the other nodes. And this reflects both who's talking and who's being referenced. Because while 23 of the 44 articles we looked at were news items, a further 13 were actually authored by employees of one of these 2 organisations. And then when we also considered the articles which mentioned these organisations, even if they weren't authored by them, that actually equates to 26, which is more than half of that data set of 44. So this kind of influence is what this map is showing, not just who's talking, but also who's being referenced and mentioned in the articles about these issues. But how are these voices related to the frames? Well, what we see is a fairly close relationship between the lesson lottery frame and these think tanks. Almost all authored pieces, so authored by Grattan or Learning First, engaged this frame, so 12 out of the total of 13 from these 2 organisations. And the vast majority of the news items which engaged the lesson lottery frame referenced them, so 16 out of the 23. Then there were further 3 opinion pieces from commercial entities which developed curriculum resources and so had a pretty clear sort of vested interest in promoting this line of argument that we should, centralise and outsource teachers' curriculum work. Meanwhile, the workload frame had a looser association with particular voices, and where it was used by Grattan and Learning First was primarily, really almost always, alongside and in support of the lesson lottery frame. So 8 of the 13 articles by these entities discussed workload, and of these 8, 7 linked it to the lesson lottery. So to us, this suggests that workload is a distinct concern within the dataset, and it's a more dispersed, and where it is adopted by these think tanks, it's quite overwhelmingly in support of centralising lesson planning because it's primarily a quality issue, not a workload issue. But what were these voices basing these arguments on? What was the evidence base? So as think tanks, they don't just pluck these ideas out of absolutely nowhere. They are based on something. They produce reports with particular kinds of evidence, and we tracked this back. And this is the content of our forthcoming piece in the journal Curriculum Perspectives. So in these reports, we see that the conversation really started with Learning First, with these reports really not including consideration of workload, but really focused on improving education through this kind of curricular intervention, this intervention into the space between the intended curriculum and what happens in the classroom. And then with the arrival of Grattan into this space, into this topic, the conversation shifts, and the intervention is repackaged as a workload solution, but always in support of that broader quality concern. So this supports our argument that from the outset, this discussion wasn't actually about workload, but that workload was leveraged as a justification for pre-existing angles on curriculum as a quality issue in which teachers are mistrusted and considered needing intervention. So, overall, what I've presented today are two projects which have examined the way in which what teachers do with curriculum is becoming increasingly seen as outside their purview. This has implications for teacher professional knowledge, with teachers arguably being de-skilled in such shifts, but also for retention and morale at a time of crippling shortages. Given teachers say that they want to do planning work, perhaps taking it away might be counterproductive. Further, identifying the role of these think tanks in promoting this outsourcing represents a new project for such organisations, beyond an emphasis on the nature of the intended curriculum, which has really been what the focus of much of the debate about curriculum in Australia has been up to now, really. This finding of the role of think tanks here and what they're arguing for in such a public way within the print media is also significant because it opens up space within public imagination for intervention between what's intended and what's enacted. And that raises questions about what's going to fill this space. For instance, we see an indication in our data that commercial entities may be seeking to claim this space. This is not entirely new. Textbooks, of course, have been used, for example, have been produced and used in schools for a long time. However, we do think that creating a public narrative in which lesson planning becomes accepted as external to the core purview of teachers arguably expands the legitimacy of such commercial interests. And while teachers are not blind consumers of commercial resources, such resources have nevertheless been shown to be biased and of varying quality. And yet, interestingly, the articles we've analysed do not always argue for this curriculum work to be done by commercial entities. In particular, articles associated with the Grattan Institute argue for these to be developed primarily by government organisations. However, governments can push particular agendas and ways of thinking about learning and teaching just as much as commercial entities can. For instance, we note in New South Wales, at least, a recent fairly controversial push for direct instruction, signalling that government organisations have their own ideas about pedagogy and that resources that they provide may not also, if they can ever be, neutral. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, really, I'd like to emphasise that although workload was picked up as a justification for the centralisation of curriculum resources and materials, or lesson plans, if you will, what I think we've shown in this analysis is that this was not the primary objective of those who were arguing for this change. Instead, we suspect workload was picked up as a current point of contention for the workforce, then strategically repurposed to support an entirely different agenda, one which argues for consistency over autonomy and which depends on a fundamental mistrust of teachers' capabilities and misunderstanding of what's important to them in their work, at least in Australia. And because of this, we need to highlight that outsourcing of teachers' curriculum work is not likely to be a useful solution to concerns of workload and work intensity. So we think it's important to keep paying attention to how teachers' curriculum work is being shaped in different policy contexts around the world and the logics and voices that are being privileged so that the needs of the teaching workforce can be appropriately heard and responded to. And that's it. And here are my references. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Megan, for the very insightful knowledge. Like, it's kind of surprising because we here see that Australia is a more advanced country with a better education, but then who knows, like the grass is not always greener on the other side. Anyway, jadi Bapak Ibu, let me translate a bit for the audience. Guru-guru di Australia itu ternyata juga mengalami workload yang berlebihan. Jadi selain ngajar jam 9 sampai jam 3, ternyata di luar itu mereka banyak pekerjaan-pekerjaan administratif gitu. Dan sekarang sudah oleh Dr. Megan ini dibuat penelitian begitu ya, bagaimana kita bisa mengatasi hal tersebut dengan lesson plan yang dibentuk oleh para guru itu sendiri seperti itu. Right. Okay. I see. Well, but first of all, congratulations. We get around 90 people today. I do not expect this much. So yeah, I hope this will be fruitful and more people can join. If the Zoom room is already like limited, you can check out our YouTube live stream. It's being live streamed on the YouTube. Then yeah, you can have it as a document for your portfolio. Like, Okay, let's see the chat box. This is from La Buddha or Miss Lala. Excuse me, my respected Dr. Megan and Miss Ria. I want to ask about what's the best ways to measure and evaluate teacher workload in order to find appropriate and sustainable solutions. It's a very challenging question, I guess. So, is there any measurement to evaluate their work?
It's a fantastic question. I think in a lot of ways, this is the question that I think we need to be asking now. So another project that I've been working on recently is based in Queensland, working with the Queensland Teachers Union. And we've been in the process of, we have developed an app actually as a sort of way of measuring teacher time use. It's called the Time Use app. It's a very creative name. And teachers log what they're doing for 30-minute periods of time. They'll be sent sort of random like a time slot to do. It's kind of it's called time sampling. So the idea is that across the whole cohort of people involved in the study, we get a picture of a week, but each teacher is only reporting on 3 separate 30-minute slots of time. Anyway, so the aim with that project is to try and look not just at what teachers are doing, but also how the activities that they're doing are related to how they feel, and that kind of is subjective experience of time, because we think that even though this is a lot of the work that I've been involved in myself, that a focus on workload is always going to be a little bit limited. So it's not just about the hours that people do. It's actually about the quality of that time, and the way in which that time feels. So in this project, for instance, we look at the work of Ulrich Beck, who talks about how you can some hours feel heavier than others, and there can be a sort of residue after a particularly heavy hour that kind of lingers and stays with you later into the day. So how is this experienced, not just what is done in particular sort of blocks of time throughout the day. So I think it's going to be important moving forward to look not just at workload, but also at work intensity. So how's it felt? How does it feel? How is it experienced? And also not to just think about intensification as something that's happened recently, but actually the complex nature of what teaching is. So another thing that we've kind of looked at in that project is teacher decision-making as something that is really exhausting for teachers, having to make lots and lots of decisions throughout the day, juggle lots of different things that are happening at the same time, some decisions being really high stakes, and how that kind of intensity in teaching that's been there for a long time perhaps hasn't been recognised. So I think there's a lot still to do to really understand what makes teaching so tiring and so draining, so that we can then think about how to make it better. So that was a really long-winded answer, but thank you for the question, Labuda. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, yeah, we're still working on that. So yeah, continuing from your answer, like maybe we get a bit curious about what kind of administrative jobs that Australian teachers have to do, because here in Indonesia, that's including managing the school budgeting, the financial, and then recruiting new students, and like everything in between. It's just not academic at all. So how about the administrative jobs there?
Yeah. Well, I'll just give a caveat first that I think what actually defines administrative work is something that I actually want to look into a little bit more, how do teachers understand what constitutes admin. I talked in my talk a little bit about how it's quite powerful what we categorize as admin and non-admin. So I don't want to give any kind of flippant comment on what is admin and what isn't. Of course, some administrative work is really, really important for teaching, and involves particular kind of pedagogical thinking, right? Sometimes. So with that caveat, I will tell you some of the things that Australian teachers have to do. So I think one of the big issues in Australia has been a requirement to really document a lot of what's happening in schools. So it's not just about going in there and teaching a class and planning for your next class and assessing. It's also about saying, well, this student did this in this class, and recording that in a particular online portal, recording marks and grades, and using that data to kind of for particular accountability purposes, I think has been one of the real frustrations. This sense that there's a lot of sort of work that's done for someone else, or perhaps for no one, but that you do it to tick a box to say that you did it because of that kind of accountability function. So I think that's been the really big frustration for teachers recently. Or another example is having to sort of make copies of student work samples just to have on file in case you get inspected by the regulatory authority. So it's really there for no one, and it's work for nothing, and it takes a lot of time.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, that's pretty much the same then. Jadi Bapak Ibu, guru-guru di sana juga ada tugas-tugas admin ya. Tapi mostly tugas adminnya nggak sampai yang kayak mengelola dana BOS atau bagaimana, enggak. Tapi seperti ya itu tadi akreditasi, lalu mengumpulkan tugas-tugas anak-anak. Kalau nanti ada inspeksi, jadi mereka bisa langsung menunjukkan gitu aja. Okay, I see Pak Iswahyudi here, already raised his hand for a long time. Sorry, Pak Iswahyudi. So please, Pak Iswahyudi, what's your question in English or Bahasa Indonesia? Please unmute. Yeah, please, Pak
Oke,
Iswahyudi.
thank you Bu Ria. Ini sama-sama belajar bahasa Inggris.
Oh yeah, okay. So please.
Okay, this is an issue with the curriculum in Australia, because in Indonesia there are frequent change before fully understanding one curriculum. Another new curriculum is implemented. Thank you, Bu Ria.
Oh yeah. Yeah, also it's my question. Yeah, because in Indonesia, the curriculum keeps changing. Like since 1947 until this very day, we already changed our curriculum for about 9 or 10 times. And sometimes it's not in the very particular period of time. Sometimes one curriculum stays for 10 years or longer, and one curriculum is only for 3 years. And then after that, we change our minister, and then we have another new curriculum. So what do you think in Australia, how often your curriculum is changed, and what's the ideal time period for a curriculum to, make the most out of it or to take it into results? So please, Megan.
Yes, okay. This is a slightly complicated question in Australia, and I'll speak mostly I'll talk at sort of national level, but also New South Wales, because both are relevant. So I think I mentioned that we had a national curriculum brought in around 2012. That because of the complicated relationship between the federal government and the state governments in Australia, where schooling is technically supposed to be a state responsibility, even though we have a national curriculum, this then gets kind of interpreted and rolled out by state bodies. So the national curriculum in each state actually looks quite different because it's been interpreted at the state level in slightly different ways. So that's the first thing. And since that came out in 2012, there have been lots and lots of updates. I think we're up to around version 9. Not always with a huge change, but still something that kind of needs to be taken into account. In the state of New South Wales, we are just in the midst of the rollout. I don't like that term because it implies, this simple kind of implementation, which of course is not what actually happens, but I'll just use it for the sake of ease. The rollout of what's being referred to as the biggest reform to New South Wales curriculum in, I think they said something like 30 years or something like that. And in some ways it is a full kind of overhaul in a way that we haven't seen previously. But because of the changes with the Australian curriculum, I think teachers do feel like there has been quite a lot of change. And certainly this current one that we're seeing is a big change for teachers to cope with. And it's been interesting to see with this current state curriculum that's new, they've also been providing a lot of very, very detailed teaching advice that comes with the syllabus document, which is getting to what I've been talking about today, because it is quite specific pedagogical advice that really shapes pedagogy in a particular way. There's also been a lot of really detailed resources, like sample resources, that have been provided to schools. So I wonder if we are seeing via this reform a bit more of that kind of seeking to control what's actually happening in classrooms, or maybe shape's a better word, what's happening in classrooms as well.
All right. Okay. So it's like, it's not changing like drastically change, but you do some upgrades like as the time goes
Oh, this one in New South Wales is a drastic change.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
But it's the first drastic change in about 30 years. So yeah.
Oh, 30 years, right. Okay. So Pak Iswahyudi mungkin bisa diikuti nggih. Jadi kurikulum di sana itu berubahnya sedikit-sedikit. Yang baru-baru ini 2012 itu lumayan drastis, tapi dia drastis selama kurun waktu 30 tahun terakhir. Dan sekarang sudah 2024. Jadi upgrade-nya ya sedikit-sedikit mulai 2012 sampai 2024. Jadi memang ada waktu ideal berubah, tapi berubahnya sedikit-sedikit. Sekalinya drastis ya harusnya dia agak long term begitu ya. Bisa dipahami nggih Pak Isoyudi? Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, no worries at all. So from Pak Kholidan, okay. Do you think the current curriculum in Australia is better than before? The way that you say changed drastically? There's this talk in Indonesia that previous curriculum is better than the current, but well, I don't know. I don't follow this talk. So how about you, Megan?
I think it's really, I think it's yet to be seen. You know, it's only rolling out at the moment. Certainly there are some teachers, so we've been doing some interviews as part of a project on this curriculum reform, which is separate to the ones I've been talking about today. And a lot of the teachers that we've talked to so far have been quite positive about it. They've said that, you know, it really was needed. We needed this kind of refresh. But I don't think that is the view of all teachers. I think some teachers do feel like it's sort of change for change's sake. So I think there's a variety of views out there. And I think it also depends a little bit on the particular subject area. Some teachers are happier with some subject areas than others for different reasons. So yeah, it's mixed views so far, and maybe in a couple of years I'll have a clearer answer for you. But it's a very important question, so thank you.
Does it come with toolkit when you say like some teachers are happier, the other teachers not? Or does it come with something to help them to teach, maybe more like guided content subject or something?
Yeah, the subjects are fairly similar, most of them. I believe some have changed their names. But yeah, there is quite a lot of guidance that comes with the new one, which is good, I think, because some teachers find it helpful, as long as it doesn't become seen as the only way in which to do it, I think, is the danger with that.
All right. Okay. Well, then we have another question. Pak Musodikul Umam, please, Pak Musodikul. Bapak Ibu yang lain sambil nunggu bisa dicek di chat box, itu ada link presensi ya, silakan diisi karena nanti dapat sertifikat. Please Pak Musodikul.
Yeah, thank you, Kuliah and Dr. Megan. May I ask questions? Can you tell us how much is salary and for Australian teacher, and is there any difference between private teacher salary and non-private teacher salary? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pak Musodikul. Okay, it's about the well-being, the salary. Well, it's also been asked by Muhammad Munadi, but in Bahasa Indonesia, right? In Indonesia, it's very, very low, like unbelievably low. Teachers gotta take home pay for about, if we count it with Australian dollars, it's about $200 a month, like not more than that.
Oh,
and
wow.
yeah, it's too low. Like it's just unbelievable. So how is it in Australia? Like, although your workload is a lot, so how's the well-being, the salary? Can you please give us?
Yes, I don't know the exact figure. I'm just looking it up. You can find it online. We have actually just won a quite significant pay rise for teachers in New South Wales, and this, or public school teachers, I should say. And this was largely due to the unions campaigning around the issue primarily of workload. So, you know, teachers were kind of out in the streets saying, we're doing all of this work. We really do deserve a pay rise. And they did actually get it, which was fantastic. You know, it was described as a once in a generation pay rise. Can't find exactly what it is, but please, you can always look it up yourself. I think it's something around 80 to 90 a year. Thousand a year. Yeah, I think it's something like that. The question of private schools versus public schools. In the private sector in Australia, which is quite large, it's about sort of 40% of all schools, just a bit under that. It's very diverse. You know, we have some private schools that are very, very well resourced and very wealthy. We do have some that are less wealthy. But my understanding is that the award for private sector schools, independent schools, is a little bit higher than in New South Wales, although I haven't checked that since our public sector pay rise, so I don't know if that's still true, but it was recently. And certainly at the schools that are very wealthy, you do get paid a bit more. It's their way of kind of creaming the talent of the other schools, I think. But yeah.
Right, oke, thank you Megan. Jadi Pak Musodikul dan yang lainnya nggih gajinya sekitar 80.000 sampai 90.000 dolar setahun. Kalau dikurskan ya sekitar 800 sampai 900 juta. In which in New South Wales, I mean like how much do we need to live alone? About 60,000 I guess or more. Ya, jadi dengan gaji segitu dan biaya hidup yang di bawah itu 60.600 juta ya insya Allah masih cukup-cukup aja. Dan kalau private schools, kalau dia sekolahnya bagus, SPP-nya lebih mahal, lebih kaya ya gurunya gajinya lebih tinggi. Jadi sama aja. Okay, now let's move on to the next question from Pak Ari. Are you alright, Megan? I think we have 5 more minutes. Like, yeah, people are really, well, I see getting darker there. The winter.
It is getting darker. That's okay.
Okay, so how's the curriculum implemented in Australia, especially? Is there a special department for the vocational school? Because here in Indonesia, we have lots of vocational schools and also polytechnic, but all of us have to follow the national curriculum, which is for like a common school or general school, not specifically designed for the vocational school. How is it in Australia?
Yes, so we don't have sort of technical or vocational skills until students are at the very end of their secondary schooling, at which time they might choose to follow that pathway, and then they would go to an organisation called TAFE, Technical and Further Education, I think it stands for. So schools in Australia are generally the same. There are some academically selective schools, particularly in New South Wales. We have quite a few. I'm talking here in the public sector, but most schools are broadly comprehensive schools where everyone pretty much studies the same curriculum. I mean, there are issues of residualisation of schools, not by name, so they might be called the same kind of school, but we do see students in terms of background and advantage and therefore associations with how well they do in school being concentrated in different schools, but it's not something that is supposed to happen. It is just something that does happen. It is a byproduct of the way in which we've structured our system and the way in which we encourage parents to actively kind of choose between schools. But everyone follows the same curriculum.
All right. Okay. So about the TAFE, does it work under the TVET or do they have? I heard something about the TVET, the vocational and engineering.
Yeah. TAFE is very separate to what I'm talking about here. Yeah, so I think they have their own systems. There are some courses that cross. Sometimes you might do it in school, sometimes you might do it in TAFE or do some in each, but it's only in those last 2 years of school.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Jadi gitu ya Pak Ari, karena memang SMK itu tidak ada, jadi kurikulumnya juga tidak dibuat. Tapi kalau di sana ada yang namanya TAFE, TAFE, jadi Teaching of Academic and Further Education or something, itu khusus yang mau melanjutkan SMK. Jadi setelah SMA mereka harus ambil TAFE. Kalau di sini semacam politeknik mungkin, polinema, dan itu kurikulumnya jadi ada sendiri. Jadi semuanya di sana SMK, tidak ada SMK. Jadi tidak ada kurikulum. Gitu deh. Okay. I think this is the last question, Megan, if you're right with that. Yeah, right. Mbak Siti Nur Aisyah, you already raised your hand.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Megan. Thank you for your remarkable presentation, and also thank you, Ms. Ria, for the time. As we observe in Indonesia, we experience visible inequality in education quality. So this is particularly between schools in urban and suburban territories. So in terms of workload, particularly, suburban teachers take over a lot of administration works due to the shortage of human resources there. So what do you think is the best way to cope with this problem? Because this is so far for this long time, it is it doesn't know it isn't noticed by the government. So yeah, in terms of promote education quality, what do you think of this? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Siti, for the question. That's a really hard one to finish on. Oh, yeah. I guess I think it's really problematic if we try to put the solutions for a problem like that at the feet of the teachers in the schools, because it is not their fault that they are under-resourced in these ways. I think it really does require a systemic response. But I take your point that it doesn't seem like maybe the government is listening to this issue. And then it does feel like, well, what can be done? But I do think that when we try to say that, well, we just need to be a little bit more flexible at the local level, or we just maybe need to have some well-being programs for teachers where they maybe, do yoga or whatever it might be, which I don't know if that's something you get told to do, but it happens in Australia. That is really not a sustainable long-term solution, and that really it has to come down to the resourcing of those schools in a kind of centralized way. There is no other long-term sustainable solution, I think, to that problem. So I don't know if that's something that can be kind of campaigned around in your context, but that might be one potential way forward that certainly teachers in Australia have tried to use.
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Megan. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, Mbak Siti. We have the same
Yeah,
problem,
thank you.
especially in Indonesia, when we try to be centralized, teachers don't have resource. So I think, the problem lingers. We need to campaign more on that. Yeah, just like I just. Okay, well, it's already the time, I guess. It's time to wrap up. So, Megan, you display your emails, and maybe if that's okay, if someone wants to approach you and ask their question, especially related to education. And then I personally interested in because I'm researching the teacher professional development, agency, identity, how do you feel moving from the high school teacher to a lecturer? Maybe things we can talk more later in another. It's a drastic change. Right, okay. So everyone, once again, don't forget to fill in the presentation, the form in the chat box, just you get the certificate. Okay. Well, I think this is the wrap up. Thank you very much once again, Megan. That was a very wonderful time. And I guess everyone get an insight about how is the education compared between Australia and Indonesia. And it seems we face some kind of similar problems, which can be resolved by teachers themselves if they work together with the policymakers or the stakeholders. And especially with your systematic literature review research, we look forward to read it, and maybe if you can provide it and send it to my email, I'll ask you personally for that, and I'll distribute it to the audience, right? Okay.
Sounds great.
Okay, so thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's been great.
I said also, have a great weekend. I'll see you when I see you. Okay, so bye.
Bye-bye.
Ya, Bapak Ibu, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya,
Thank you.
terima kasih. Assalamualaikum.